today. I'm delighted to be welcoming Judith Suissa for today's session for a presentation on where and how will education take place. Judith is Professor of Philosophy of Education at the Institute of Education, University College London. She came into philosophy of education from philosophy and by doing a BA and an MA in philosophy, and her PhD was a philosophical exploration of the tradition of anarchist education. Judith shares that belief with most of us, I guess, in this room, that philosophical ideas are at the heart of all central questions about education. And she invites the political perspectives offered by anarchist theory and other radical traditions, as we will see today, to address those questions. She says, I found on your institutional webpage, and I'm going to quote you here, rather than try to summarize your areas of interest, that I'm interested in the intersection between political ideas and educational practice. I am particularly concerned to challenge the narrow focus on state schooling characteristics of so much educational philosophy, theory, and research, and to explore the underlying political and moral assumptions of pedagogical relationship outside the arena of institutional forms of education. These include parent-child relationships, educational experiments that challenge sorry, I've lost my line here. That challenge the state system and informal education. My research draws on political and moral philosophy with a particular focus on anarchy theory, questions of social justice, the control of education, utopian theory, social change, and the role of the state. So in this talk today, Judith suggested that she would explore the unstated assumptions often embedded in philosophical work on the aims of education, and then draw on work from anarchist theory, I've said already, and the history of radical educational experiments to suggest that philosopher of education should perhaps look more closely at the kinds of educational practice associated with these traditions and how they can offer productive ways of thinking about our educational spaces of today and of the future. So thanks very much, Judith, for accepting this invitation. We're delighted to have you with us. You'll have 45 minutes, roughly, for introducing the discussion today, and then we will open up to questions and comments from the audience. So the floor is yours for about 45 minutes. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. Can people hear me? Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. I know we're all still getting used to being in a space, a physical space, to discuss ideas. After the last 2 years, it feels a bit strange, quite exciting. I have to say, I also find it really exciting to be in the Thomas Paine Centre. I just thought I'd note that. Okay, so I think I have to apologise to Jeff, who first invited me to give this talk, and I gave him a completely different title. And this paper has kind of evolved as my thinking about what I wanted to talk about has evolved, and the titles kind of followed it. So I want to start off by thinking about this phrase, the aims of education. Philosophers of education for decades, some might even think for longer than that, have tried to offer answers to the question, what should the aims of education be, or what are the aims of education? In the period that's often regarded as the heyday of analytic, Anglophone philosophy of education that's very much associated with this country and particularly with the institute where I work, in that period of work in the discipline, there was a kind of flourishing of books and papers by philosophers, mostly coming from the analytic tradition, who attempted to answer this question of the aims of education. And this is just a small selection of some of the books with the kind of titles I'm alluding to, and there were, I think, literally dozens of papers with similar titles. Often this work explicitly offered an answer to the question, what is the aim of education? What should the aim of education be? Often it consisted of philosophical analyses of specific concepts associated with education, whether it was the concept of education itself or learning, teaching, knowledge, and so on. Often this work also consisted of criticisms of dominant trends in educational practice. So at the height of the progressive movement and its popularity in primary schools in this country, for example, there was a lot of work by philosophers of education critiquing the sort of underlying conceptual assumptions in forms of progressivism. So a classic paper here would be Robert Dearden's Happiness in Education, in which he basically argued that, contrary to what a lot of progressive educators like to think, it's not conceptually coherent to posit happiness as the aim of education. Right, so this was a project that really occupied a lot of time and energy and shelves in the library and provided a lot of people with, I think, very good academic careers. And there was a lot of rigorous philosophical work that came out of this project. The project itself, the sort of analytic project, was criticised from fairly early on, both by philosophers and from sociologists and other people working in education. One of the central criticisms was that this project, which ostensibly was an analytic project of clarifying the logic and the meaning of concepts, actually ended up smuggling in normative assumptions, right? And these normative assumptions, it was argued, were implicitly defending a particular political and social status quo, right? So often it turned out that the educational aims that were defended as part of a sort of analytic project of explaining what it made sense to argue could form an aim of education ended up being the very aims of education that were those ones that were promoted by the dominant form of state liberal education, which ended up then privileging certain kinds of knowledge, certain forms of education, and creating a kind of hierarchy which, it was argued, ended up also reinforcing the background socioeconomic hierarchy. So here's an example. Here's an example of one such criticism by Kevin Harris. This is from a collection, a more recent collection on the aims of education by Roger Marples, which pulls together a lot of this work. So Harris is basically arguing that there was a tendency by analytic philosophers within this tradition to talk about the aims of education as if they were just out there, or to say, you know, we know this or we can argue this, but not to actually reflect on who the collective was that they were assuming. As he argues, reality went missing. So this was a kind of criticism, I think, by people with a more sociological sort of understanding of the need to look at how educational institutions actually function, and a sort of skepticism about the project of being able to step back from that and offer a purely analytic defense of educational concepts. Other important criticisms of that work came from feminist philosophers and historians of education like Jane Rowland Martin, who argued that the kinds of conceptual accounts of the aims of education that were defended ended up defending a classic liberal ideal that privileged the intellectual and the mental, and ended up downgrading everything to do with the emotional and the practical, and thereby excluding the kinds of people, particularly women, who'd traditionally been excluded from mainstream education, sort of models of educational success and privilege. So the important point for critics like Harris was to pay attention to who had a voice in formulating the aims of education, whose aims were actually being formulated, and whose aims are taken as desirable or less desirable, what kind of knowledge is valued, what kinds of aims are valued, and what are the sort of background political and social assumptions that enable certain aims to be defended. And although this sort of analytic project was heavily criticised, it's certainly not the case that it's not still around, right? And I think some of the criticisms were quite unfair in that they tended to portray a caricature of analytic philosophy as being completely detached from the social reality of schools and schooling. I'm not sure that was ever entirely the case, because a lot of the people involved in that work were actually very closely connected to institutions of schooling, to questions about the curriculum and teacher training and so on. But there was a general sort of skepticism towards this idea that it's possible to provide a conceptual analysis of ideas like education and related concepts without making some kind of normative assumption. But there is still a large body of work that still gets produced by philosophers of education that has as its central focus this question of the aims of education, right? What should we defend as educational aims? What do we mean when we talk about educational aims? And more recently, certain particular kinds of educational aims have been particularly promoted by mainstream educational philosophers and theorists. So just to give you an example of the kind of aims that are defended: autonomy, critical thinking. A lot of work recently defends the ideal of flourishing as an educational aim. A lot of philosophers of education have, to use Christian Christensen's words, jumped on the flourishing bandwagon, right? So there are a lot of recent works that talk about flourishing as an aim of education, including, in fact, Christensen's own work, which you can see here, Flourishing as the Aim of Education. This is a very recent book that defends a neo-Aristotelian account of flourishing and why it should be at the center of educational concerns. It's not, of course, only in academia that one finds this language of the aims of education. So it's also a phrase that's used by policymakers and in public discourse and popular language. When people are talking about education, they often talk about the aims of education, right? So here's Nick Gibb talking at the Education Foundation Summit in 2015, giving a sort of typical policy speech about the latest policy on education that's about to be launched, but in the middle of his speech saying, I'd like to take a step back from the details of our reforms and turn to a broader question. What is the purpose of education? Right, so the assumption there is that it does make sense to step back from the reality of educational policy, educational institutions, and ask that question, right? What is the purpose of education? Now, I think that the criticisms of the sort of conceit, if you want, that you can step back and ask that question, have rightly alerted us to some of the problems with posing the question in that way. And this is not new, okay? I think that apart from the sort of criticisms of the worry that it's impossible to take a politically neutral stance on something like aims of education, I think there's a deeper problem here. And this was already something that John Dewey warned about over 100 years ago when he wrote in Democracy and Education, it's well to remind ourselves that education as such has no aims. Only persons, parents, and teachers have aims, not an abstract idea like education. Right? So Dewey here, although in fact he was a bit inconsistent in his own work, where he does use the phrase the aims of education elsewhere, but he is sort of alerting us to the strangeness, if you want, of thinking that an abstract concept like education can have aims, and reminding us that the business of educating, whether it's children or adults, is always done by an agent, right? It's always someone doing the educating, and it's the person doing the educating who has the aims. And that might seem like just a fairly straightforward conceptual point. And some people have taken up Dewey's point as part of a kind of general anti-foundationalism. So there is work in philosophy of education that suggests that drawing on these ideas, we need to abandon the project of articulating sort of universal normative ideas for goals and values for educational projects, and explore the ideas that are opened up by thinking about, as my colleague Paul Standish puts it, education without aims, right? And the idea there is that there's a worry behind this talk of aims. There's a worry that this will lead to a kind of narrowing of the field of education and a kind of obsession with meeting the sort of pre-specified goals and the attempt to provide, as Standish puts it, the possibility of completeness, right? And a lot of work in that field, I think, building on this critique, has developed important criticisms of performativity in educational institutions, the dominance of certain models of this kind of perfectibility and performativity, both in schools and in higher education. And I think that work is valuable, but what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk is another aspect of this conceptual point, that it doesn't make sense to talk about the aims of education. And what I want to argue is that in the contemporary context, and in fact for much of modern history, the significance of the fact that people who have aims in educating children are very different, that different people are involved in educating children, and that they might all have different aims. The significance of that is occluded, I want to say, by the dominance of a paradigmatic form of state schooling. Okay, so I think what has really prevented us from opening up our educational thinking in a different way is the dominance of a model of state schooling in which the word education tends to be conflated with the concept of schooling. Right? And I think you see this conflation all over the place, even in the work of critics like Kevin Harris, who argue that you need to be a lot more careful about whose aims are being defended and why, but he doesn't really question the idea that one can have a sort of state-controlled and state-led system of education. He just thinks we need to be careful about the kind of aims that it's promoting. Now, it might seem kind of a cheap shot to point out that you know, it's really problematic that government ministers like Nick Gibb are confusing an abstract concept with a policy goal. And you might say, well, obviously what's going on here is that he's really talking about state schooling, right? This is just a rhetorical device, and all he needs to do is be more accurate when he says, what is the purpose of education, and be honest about the fact that what he really means is the purpose of state schooling. And in fact, in the speech that quote is from, he does then go on to say, education is the engine of our economy, the foundation of our culture. It's an essential preparation for adult life. Delivering on our commitment to social justice requires us to place these three objectives at the heart of our education system. So obviously he's talking here about the state system of schooling and not about education as an abstract concept. But that slippage between education and schooling happens not just in the speeches by education policymakers. It also happens, I think, in academic work by philosophers and other theorists of education. So here's a quote from a recent book by Harry Brighouse on education, where he says himself, the idea in the book is that the central purpose of education is to promote human flourishing. But he then goes on to discuss what schools should do. Okay, and I think this is such a common slippage that we tend to not even see it as a problem, right? I think it's pretty ubiquitous. I think we tend to assume that when you say education, what you really mean is schools. And I want to problematize that assumption, and particularly to problematize the aspect of what I'll explain and what I'll call statism that's involved in that assumption. So why is it important to recall that there is a context to the aims of education, and that context in modern history is generally one that has been, I think, dominated by the state? Well, I think what this does is reinforce a way of looking at social processes and social problems that the anarchist historian and anthropologist James C. Scott calls seeing like a state. Okay, so this is Scott's book there on the right, Seeing Like a State, which is a really monumental sort of historical account of how state formation actually happened throughout history and the often violent ways in which states established themselves and expanded and dominated gradually more and more spheres of social life. And what Scott's work documents in great detail and is this aspiration to statecraft and how it involves actually a very sort of apparently disparate collection of processes which states are engaged in, all of which serve the purpose of creating forms of rendering forms of social life legible so that the state can control them in various ways, right? And he documents this through a lot of different practices. So, for example, the picture in the background here is a picture of a forest before scientific forestry became established as an important way of controlling the yield and the performance and the management of forests in Europe. Right? So this is an example of something that was a sort of organic part of how humans lived with the environment that then became standardized as part of a project of statecraft. And the same thing happened with all sorts of other processes, whether it's standardization, as he describes here, weights and measures, population registers, all sorts of ways in which state officials acting on part of the state organize and control the population in order to render all sorts of aspects of social life legible and controllable. And what's really crucial here is that what gets left out in this enterprise is all the informal aspects of how people run their lives that can't be standardized, that can't be even made visible by the state. They sort of disappear, or they just become invisible, or then they don't count in any kind of official record of what's going on. It ignores, this project of statecraft ignores essential features of any real functioning social order. And many anarchist scholars working within this field have built on Scott's work and on other historical and anthropological work to develop an account of what statism, or what I think Scott calls seeing like a state, what that actually means, how it affects more broadly our way of interacting with, theorizing, talking about the world, right? So here's a definition of statism from Ince and de la Torre, who are anarchist geographers defending the importance in geography of adopting a post-statist kind of approach and lens. Okay, so as they point out, one of the things that statism does is institute a form of organizational logic, okay, a way of thinking about how we run our lives, thinking about different aspects of our social lives. And this extends beyond the sort of formal institutions of the state, right? It extends into the very way in which we think about ourselves as existing in space and time, the very imaginations, in fact, that we use, that we bring to bear on thinking about social problems. Okay, so statism plays a role. The state, not just as a set of political institutions, but the state as a concept, as a discourse, as a way of thinking, plays a role in shaping our political and social imaginations. And I think this is significant when it comes to thinking about education, because the modern state eventually, of course, became the dominant model of social organization. It became, as Ince de la Torre put it, the most complete form of social organization. And what it did was then characterize as problematic all those forms of social organization that weren't part of the state, right? So if you think of the common phrase, the barbarians at the gate, right? This is a phrase that comes from the very real sort of political and geographical existence of the city-state, right? So the barbarians are the people who are outside the walls of the city, right? But of course, barbarian comes to mean something negative, right? It comes to mean the people who are not civilized, who haven't become, subject citizens of the state, right? They then get depicted as somehow lacking, right? As archaic, primitive, traditional, pre-modern. This is what statism does. This is what statism, as a way of imagining the world, does to non-statist forms of human living and human organization. And I think it's interesting to think of state schooling in a kind of analogous way. Right? So in an age in which universal state schooling has become so ubiquitous pretty much everywhere in the world that we conflate the concept of education with the institution of state schooling, it becomes very difficult to think of forms of education that exist outside the walls, if you want, of the state school as anything other than problematic, right? They become almost non-educational or invisible, right? Because we conflate education with schooling and because we think of schooling in this kind of statist way. So in the same way as defences of the state are often built, and this is notoriously true in political philosophy, in the tradition of contract theory, right? The defence of the state is often built on a positing of a hypothetical state of nature, right? And the state is necessary in order to protect people from the complete anarchy that would ensue if you remained in a state of nature. So this sort of hypothetical dystopia of the feral state of nature legitimates the political structures of the state and delegitimates anyone outside those structures. And I think in a similar way, the institution of state schooling and our association of that institution with being basically everything that education is about makes it very difficult for us to see individuals' educational spaces outside that institution as anything other than sort of feral or uneducated or as lacking in some way, right? And I think we see this in the kind of ways in which children who are not attending school or not attending conventional state schools are described. And you saw this certainly in the early years of the free school movement, and I mean radical free schools, not what the government calls free schools, the free schools of the 60s and 70s. So this picture on the left there is from Summerhill, Democratic School in Suffolk, which was often in its early years depicted as a kind of terrible place of anarchy with feral children just running wild, right? The idea that this could actually just be another form of education is quite difficult to conceive of when our way of understanding education and the aims of education is, I think, viewed through what I would call a statist lens. So in the same way as generations of anarchist anthropologists and historians have documented alternative forms of living and alternative forms of social organisation in societies that don't have a state structure, right? Either historical examples or contemporary self-governing communities. And I think we can learn a lot from that. And I want to suggest that in the same way, we can learn a lot from focusing on forms of education, examples of educational spaces that exist outside the spaces of state schooling. I think it's useful to focus both on the history of those projects in previous eras, but also on what they're telling us about our own ways of learning and also our own ways of being in the world. Perhaps they're offering us alternative ways of being that are difficult to see if we conceive of everything through the sort of lens of state schooling. And if we focus on a kind of normative account of the aims of education and then judge all other forms of educational spaces according to that normative account. So to give you an example of how I think this operates, this sort of delegitimating things that don't fit in with the kind of standard narrative of statist aims of education. Some of you might remember, or some of you are probably too young to remember this, but some of you probably remember that Summerhill School, which has been in existence since 1921, they celebrated their centenary last year. In 2000, they were the subject of a court case at the Independent Schools Tribunal. This was following an Ofsted report of the school that found, that made some sort of really damning reports of things that were going wrong with the school and basically threatened them with closure. The school appealed at the Independent Schools Tribunal. They won the appeal, they won the court case. It was quite a landmark event because the children of the school went to the tribunal and held a democratic school meeting in order to decide whether or not they wanted to accept the terms of the agreement that had been brokered with the Ministry of Education, with the DfE. Okay, but this is the Ofsted report that caused such problems. And what it was essentially a rejection of the educational principles of Summerhill, which are centrally about the freedom of the child. Right? So there is no compulsory attendance at lessons at Summerhill. That's a core of their educational philosophy, and that's been key to the school's practice since it was established by A.S. Neal. It's run as a self-governing democratic community. They have bi-weekly school meetings. Children make decisions about daily life at the school, and they're free to determine whether or not they go to lessons, what they choose to study, and so on. This was seen as highly problematic by the Ofsted inspectors, who claimed that for the children at the school, their education is fragmented, disjointed, and likely to adversely affect their future options. Now, clearly what's going on here is that the Ofsted inspectors were conflating the idea of education with a particular, I think, particularly narrow account of what education is that's identified with the formal institution of state schooling and with all the paraphernalia that comes with that, right? The national curriculum, standards, standardized tests, forms of assessment, and so on. Interestingly, later in the same report, they use the same phrase, fragmented, disjointed, and likely adversely to affect their future options. But here they talk about the curriculum, right? So at one point in the report, they say the children's education is fragmented. Later, they say their curriculum is fragmented, disjointed, and likely adversely to affect their future options. So here, clearly, they're using the phrase curriculum to mean the formal content of education, right? The point that Summerhill makes is that children at Summerhill are learning even when they're not sitting in classes, right? The curriculum doesn't, in Summerhill, mean a collection of formalised subjects in discrete chunks of time that are taught by subject specialists. The curriculum is the whole experience of learning that goes on as part of the school community. But there's a confusion and a conflation between the term education and curriculum. Ian Stronach has a very interesting paper commenting on this, where he I think makes the really humorous remark that in this Ofsted report, education and curriculum are apparently interchangeable terms, separable only by a split infinitive. But the bigger point that I want to make here is that by conflating talk of the aims of education with the aims of state schooling, I think what we do is we render the state and its forms of thinking about social life invisible and beyond critique, right? And we also then position as non-educational or as somehow lacking or educationally substandard forms of education that exist outside the structure of the state. Okay, so I want to now go on to sort of backtrack perhaps a little bit and talk about some work in philosophy of education, because you might think, okay, everything that I've said so far is all well and good, but there's still good reasons to defend the liberal state providing universal compulsory schooling. There's still reasons we might think that's something worth defending. And I'm not really arguing with that, okay? So I think there has in fact been some very good work in recent years by philosophers of education that has been much more explicit about what the political framework is in which they're defending an account of educational aims and why they're worth defending. Right? So a key work here, I think, is Mira Levinson's 1999 book, The Demands of Liberal Education. So she talks about the aims of education, but she's quite explicit about the fact that she's defending a version of political liberalism. And the reason she wants to defend a particular account of what state schooling should be doing and the kind of policies and curriculum policies that schools need to follow is because she thinks that's the best way to defend liberal values and liberal institutions. Right? So she argues that the particular form of compulsory universal schooling provided by the liberal state is one of the sites through which liberal values can be upheld. And it's important to defend certain kinds of schools, certain kinds of curricula in order to do that. Now, I'm not necessarily arguing with any sort of substantive point that is made in Levinson's work or in related work that defends liberal goals of state schooling. But I want to suggest that even if you don't share the anarchist skepticism about the institutions of the liberal state, there's still something educationally and, I would argue, politically valuable that we might miss if we ignore the way in which these statist paradigms have dominated our theoretical and practical ways of talking about education. So something can be gained, I think, if we adopt what James C. Scott calls an anarchist squint. Okay, this is a term that comes from his book, 2 Cheers for Anarchism, where he's actually got a lot of criticism from some anarchists within the movement because he's sort of maybe not a full-blooded anarchist, right? Because he's saying, well, all I'm arguing is that if you put on these, what he calls anarchist glasses, and look at the history of, for example, popular movements, revolutions, state formation, politics, all sorts of other aspects of our social and political lives, certain things will appear that are obscured if we just look at things through the status lens that is, as he's argued in his other work, the lens that's commonly adopted by mainstream historians. And so Scott is not someone who wants to argue that the state is always the enemy of human freedom, right? So he will at times agree that it's quite reasonable to defend the state and its institutions for goals that are perhaps commensurable with the goals of an anarchist. But his point is, I think, in paying attention to the way social life, political life, politics plays out, and the kinds of politics which perhaps we don't see if we identify politics and political institutions with the state. And I think this is a useful lens perhaps to adopt for thinking about education. Right? And one term that has now sort of come up along and that perhaps needs to be defined is the idea of the political. So I'm very drawn here to the work of Hannah Pitkin, who I think has a definition of politics that I'm quite comfortable with. So I want to make it quite explicit that when I talk about political, I'm not talking about the state or party politics, but in a much more general term, I think politics can be described as exactly this process that Pitkin, as Pitkin puts it here, how people determine what they will collectively do, settle how they live together, and decide their future to whatever extent that is in their power. So that's what I mean when I talk about political, and that's what I want to defend when I talk about education as being irreducibly political. And this then brings me on to another sort of body of work that, again, I'm quite sympathetic to, but I think I also have some reservations about. So I do want to resist the narrative of, on the one hand, deschooling, which was very popular again in the 60s and 70s. You've probably heard of Ivan Illich, who I think also there's another anniversary celebrated last year of Illich's publication of Deschooling Society. I'm a bit skeptical about that narrative because to me what's being suggested in this idea that the problem is institutionalizing education, often that suggests that there's this kind of pure form of education and learning. And if only we could free that from the institution of the school, then we'd be able to get back to a kind of real education, real learning. I think that's problematic because I think all educational encounters, all educational engagement is political in the sense that it has to do with this process that Pitkin describes about thinking how we're going to live our lives together. I don't think there's any way in which you can free education as a social process from politics. And so I also want to distance myself a little bit from the kind of work in philosophy of education that has tried to recover an idea of education as an ethical practice or a practice in its own right. So this is, again, I think an important body of work, a lot of which has been developed by philosophers of education working sometimes within a kind of neo-Aristotelian perspective. So this is a quote from Porrig Hogan's work on education as a practice. What seems to be suggested here, again, is that education needs to somehow free itself from the world of politics, right? Free itself from the kind of subordination to some external political goals and aims. And again, I'm quite skeptical about that because politics in these accounts tends to be positioned as something that we should be suspicious of. And that's not how I want to think about the relationship between educational spaces and politics or political life. Other philosophers of education who've developed an account of the school as a sort of non-political space is work by Jan Maskelyne and Martin Simons, who've, again, I think defended, here building on Hannah Arendt, who I'll come back to in a minute, this idea of the school as a kind of place that's almost set apart from the world of politics. I'm just really not convinced by these accounts. And I've always thought that all forms of educational interaction, including informal forms of educational interaction like that between parents and children, is political in some sense, in that it has to do with how we think about the world, how we interpret the world, the kind of values and ideas about how the world should be that we are constantly grappling with when we try to introduce children into the world. And I've defended something like this in my work with Stefan Ramaekers on parenting. So I'm going to leave out this example of parenting because it's perhaps going a bit off track, but I'm happy to come back to that maybe if there's time in discussion. So I do want to get back to Aeron, because it does seem that in objecting to this idea of the school as a non-political space, it does seem as if I'm sort of setting myself in opposition, not just to a lot of work in my own discipline, but also specifically to the work of Hannah Arendt, who in her essay, The Crisis in Education, which is a hugely problematic essay, I think, for many reasons, but also a very important essay. She famously makes this distinction between the world as it is and the world as we want it to be. Right? Arendt thinks that the role of the educator is to introduce the child into the world as it is, not the world as they want it to be. She's very wary of this idea that education should be determined by political aims. Right? And she draws a distinction here between adults and children. So adults as political agents operate in public, in the world, speak to each other in sort of pluralistic spaces, whereas children are not yet political agents. Right? They're being prepared to enter into the world of politics, and so politics should be kept out of spaces of politics. And this work, I think, has been taken up and developed, and also critically developed by a lot of contemporary Arendtian scholars. And I do want to get back to Aeron, but I do want to strongly resist the idea that there can be any kind of educational spaces that are completely non-political. And I think that's true even of educators who position themselves explicitly outside the mainstream political goals of state education. So A.S. Neal, for example, who founded Summerhill, said at several points in his writings that he didn't believe that adults had any right to impose a political view or a moral view on children. He thought children should be able to find their own values in the world through the experience of freedom. But of course, even Neal, in a way, was introducing children into a particular political understanding of the world by setting up a democratic community. Right? So children at Summerhill are learning particular ways of being in the world. They're learning what it is to be a member of a democratic community. So I would argue that that is a political intervention, whether you like it or not. But to get back to Aeron, I think there's something that we can take from Aeron, even if we are skeptical about the arguments that she makes for separating out the world of the school from the adult public world of politics. And certain contemporary philosophers of education, I think, have taken Arendt's work and developed it in ways that acknowledges these problems, but also builds on them. So Helt Biester, for example, I think, has argued that Aeron perhaps is wrong about this rigid separation between the school and politics, but she's right in her important emphasis on what it means to have authority or to take authority as an educator, to take responsibility for introducing the child as a newcomer into the world that we share. Right? Biester argues that the problem with Arendt is that she subscribes to a kind of developmentalism. Right? She relies on an unquestioned, rigid distinction between the adult and the child. And that makes it impossible for her to acknowledge the political dimensions of educational processes and practices. Now, clearly what worried Arendt, given her own life experience of fascism in Europe, was the worry that a totalitarian regime would take control of education. So her association with sort of top-down political systems of education was a sort of fairly terrifying idea in which children and individuals had sort of no freedom within the system, and that the idea, as she put it, was that you have to begin with children if you want to change the world in any revolutionary way. So her horror of totalitarianism, I think, was what led her to be very wary of the idea that political aims should have any role in education. But I think it also kind of blinded her to the ways in which all education is inevitably in some way political, and that it involves both questions about the world as it is and about the world as we'd like it to be. And in fact, what I want to say is it's quite difficult to separate out those two aspects of our interaction with children, with each other. And I think when you come down to it, any kind of question that you might be talking to children about, once you start to think about questions of meaning, I would argue it's quite impossible to separate out questions of the world as it is from the world as we'd like it to be, right? And that's not to sort of reject the importance of truth in education and in politics, another theme that Aeron wrote a lot about. But I think education, in a way, is the space where we're constantly grappling with those questions. And so where I'm quite sympathetic to work like Beaster's that tries to sort of take something valuable from Arendt while criticising it, again, I think this work tends to talk about the school. And I think it's worth making a distinction between the school as an idea and schools. And again, to me, this echoes a kind of statism. Right? We talk about the school as if there is just one model of the school, and it's generally the kind of school that we picture when we think about state schooling systems. I think perhaps it's more productive to think not about the school as an idea, but about schools. And in talking about schools, I'm really influenced here by the work of Colin Ward, the anarchist theorist, educator, Renaissance man in many ways. And Ward, I think, like other theorists within this tradition, was very careful not to talk about the school, but to talk about schools, actually existing different spaces where children came together and learned and experienced life. And schools, as he puts it here, should be not a special place, a special institution set apart from the rest of social life, but a particular user of every public space, a place where the daily lives of community and its children are inextricably mixed, just as they were for most people all through history. Right? And what I think the modern era of state schooling has done is not only encourage us to think about education in a certain way, but also actually created schools as educational places that are separate and carved off from the rest of social life. And so I think Ward here is in a way very close to the ideas of other democratic educational theorists like Dewey, for example, Paul Goodman. But I think he's also getting at something that tends to be forgotten in the sort of contemporary landscape when we think about the aims of education and immediately conflate that with the aims of schooling, and then in our mind imagine schools as very particular places. Sophie here is working on a book on Colin Ward that I know is coming out in a couple of months' time, so I'm really excited about that, and I recommend it because I think he had a lot to say about education, and his work is I think, probably not very well known these days. So I'm really glad that there are other people rediscovering it and making it more widely known. So I think, to go back to the idea of the anarchist squint, what we need to do in a way sort of analogous to Scott's anarchist squint is to sort of refocus our attention away from these big questions of the aims of education and back onto particular educational spaces. And part of what that allows us to do is to see these spaces not just as offering alternative ways of teaching children, alternative ways of learning, but also actually alternative ways of being. Right? So I think radical educators who existed and experimented with educational spaces outside of state schooling, they weren't just trying to offer children a different kind of education. They were trying to live a very different kind of life, to offer different ways of social being. And this quote from Neil, I think, in a way captures this, that I think he himself was kind of aware of the fact that he wasn't really engaged in the same project as teachers or teacher trainers or ministers of education are trying to think, how can we make the education system better, right, more effective, make teaching more effective. He was engaged in a very different project, right? He was actually engaged in the project of setting up a democratic community. And I think if you see those educational experiments in that light, then I think it helps us sort of think differently about the distinction we make between politics and education, and it helps us to focus on schools rather than the school as places for children to be. What kind of places do we want children to be, to grow up in? What kind of social spaces do we want? What spaces do we want to create? What kind of social values and interpersonal relational values do we want to enact in those spaces? That then becomes the question that we focus on, rather than what is the aim of education and how can it be realized through particular institutional structures. So, yeah, I think I'm probably running out of time, right? I've got a few minutes. Okay, so I'll just finish by asking sort of where this leaves us with the defence of state schooling, right? And I am very aware of the fact that at a time like today, it's quite problematic to be seen as questioning the role of the state in providing schools for children, right? We live in an age in which the public project of publicly funded education is under attack, right? There's a lot of people have pointed to the ways in which privatization has come into the system at all sorts of levels, the inequalities associated with that, right? So I'm not calling for an abandonment of the project of the state funding and providing educational spaces. But what I am calling for, I think, is just a sort of subtle shift in how we think about what that project is. So rather thinking about it as a way to realise the aims of education, as if that's something that can be sort of decided and then implemented in a top-down fashion, and everything then becomes documented and judged through that sort of top-down status lens. I think maybe we should think of state education as a way to sort of create the spaces or to enable different spaces to exist so that different things can happen in those spaces that might not all fit in with one particular model of what the aims of education should be. And here again, I find Aeron's work quite fruitful. So Aeron had a notoriously problematic understanding of the conceptual distinction between the public and the private. And there's a lot that one can say about that. And in fact, Hannah Pitkin, who I mentioned earlier, I think has a very rigorous critique of Aeron's understanding of the public, which, as she points out, kind of leaves out all the messy business of how we actually manage our lives together. But one valuable thing that I think is worth holding on to in Aeron's account of the public is that she defends the idea of the public as a space of plurality, a place of plurality and action. And I know Jeff Hinchliffe is here, has written about Aeron's concept of action. I think that's a really helpful addition to this work. I don't have time to go into that in detail, but what I want to focus on is the connection between this account of the public as a sphere of action and democracy, and the need in democracy for what political theorist Bonnie Honig calls public things. Okay, so actual material things. So Honig points out that democracy needs public things, infrastructure, monuments. She points to very sort of real things like libraries that citizens use, that people use, that they engage with in a material sense, that they repair, that they maintain, and that are gathered up, that they're gathered up by. So she uses Winnicott's psychoanalytic ideas here of object relations to argue that these public things form a really important function in gathering people up, bringing them together around common objects. And I think when spaces are genuinely public, in that sense, involving people coming together around a shared need and working through their different understandings of the world, their different values, then I think they become spaces in which education can be a really exciting and productive tension. What I think happens in sort of statist forms of thinking about schools and education is that productive tension gets kind of ironed out because we think that all the really important political questions have been answered, right? So Aeron's idea of public spaces, as Peter Lilja points out, is dependent on a structure to hold these spaces, right? So Arendtian politics needs a kind of housing, right? So I think it's useful perhaps to think of the state as that housing, right? It's not the sort of completely monopolistic way of seeing and organising the world that anarchists have pointed out as problematic, but perhaps we can see it as just providing the sort of shell or the housing for the real forms of political action that can take place in all these different plural spaces. And in the same way, I think perhaps we can think of schools as being that kind of housing, okay? The housing in which real public educational political encounters can take place. So a call for schools to be more genuinely public spaces, I think, is a call to pay attention to what goes on in the spaces of the school, to the kinds of spaces that they are, and to defend the public provision of schools, not just as a way of implementing a preconceived top-down idea of the aims of education, but as a way to guarantee that we can have more genuinely public spaces. Because those public spaces, I think, are disappearing, right? And there's certainly a lot to be said in the era of COVID and perhaps post-COVID about how those material public spaces are disappearing. So defending public education then means not just defending the institution of state schooling, but defending the idea of schools in a great variety of schools, not just state schools, all sorts of educational spaces, as genuinely public political spaces. And I think this also encourages us to think about the notion of the public and the private in different ways. And Rebecca Solnit has written about this. So we tend to think of privatization in education as being a bad thing, as sort of encroaching on the provision of public services by the welfare state. But as she points out, privatization also means this sort of retreat of citizens into private spaces and private lives, instead of being in shared public spaces with others and acting in public in these sort of plural spaces. So anarchist scholarship, as I said, has documented some of these alternative spaces. Historians of education have documented very different kinds of educational spaces, and I think we can learn from those accounts and think about what it means to be a different public educational space if we look at these spaces through the lens not of the aims of education or the goals of education in the liberal state, but through the idea of what it is to come together to deal with what Aeron calls the elementary problems of human living together. And I think a lot of alternative educational spaces are essentially doing that. Right? They're essentially trying to deal with the elementary problem of humans living together. And I think this is what we forget if we just think of schools and schooling as being part of one kind of monopolistic vision of education controlled by the state. I think that tends to reduce politics and political questions to questions of policy. It implies that we've answered all the important questions about how we should live together, what kind of spaces we need to create to enable us to live together. And it, I think, prevents us from exploring and imagining other forms of social and political life. So anarchist theorists have developed this idea of post-statist perspectives that can be valuable lenses through which to see what goes on in different disciplines. I think that's something perhaps that we need a bit more of in education. And that's why I think it's worth paying more attention both to historical examples of alternative educational spaces that don't fit into the logic of state school, and perhaps nurturing and supporting those spaces today in an age when state schooling, you might think, is more powerful than ever, but also perhaps in the wake of the pandemic being questioned again, because so many of the sort of taken for granted forms of state schooling suddenly just sort of didn't seem to exist in the last couple of years. And I think perhaps that's an interesting opening to reimagining or rediscovering some of these other ways of thinking about educational spaces. So thank you. Sorry, I went much longer than I thought I would.
Thank you very much. Judith, would you like to join us and have a drink, take a bit of a break? So thank you very much to Judith Suissa for this very exciting presentation. We now have a little bit of time for digesting, discussing, questioning, and so the floor is yours. You're all welcome to come up with comments or questions. We've got microphones circulating around, so please ask for a microphone if you would like to say something so that we can all hear you well, and more importantly, we can capture your question on the recording as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was gripping. I'm a child of the 70s. I was taken out of school at the age of 9 in 1973 and told to teach myself. So I am the sort of complete educational experiment, and your talk was just riveting. And I know I probably shouldn't even be asking this on a public microphone. I'd really love to talk to you more. So many of your ideas are just kind of like going ping, ping, ping in my mind. I can't really talk about it all. But I would like to advocate that we need to be extremely careful with the alternatives. We really need to look out for the individuals. Summerhill was, in dialogue with my father quite a bit, and there was a moment where we might go there, but I'm very pleased I didn't go there. And I think, there are things wrong with the state system, but I think there's a lot to watch out for with alternative systems. And there's a huge dialogue that needs to take place, which I think you're asking for, but I don't know how many people are involved in that dialogue that actually come from the alternative side. And I think that that's very important, because the alternative side has a huge impact on the individuals involved, So I worry for the kids coming out of Summerhill, even now, because I don't think it's as rounded as it makes out, or as grounded. So, I would love to have more of conversation around that. It's not really a question, it's more like, just a request that we are very, very careful with looking at alternative forms of education and the dialogue between conventional and alternative, really.
Yeah, thank you for that. All I would say is I don't think it's that there's sort of state schooling and then the alternative. And I think there's a danger in that as well, as characterising all alternative schools as being a sort of, similar model. Summerhill is a particular school, and it's I think people who went to Summerhill at different periods in history will have had quite different experiences, because it's also, existing in a social and political landscape. There are many other models of alternative schools that are quite different, right, on a spectrum from, extreme libertarian to much closer to what you might recognise as a sort of conventional school. So I think that's, in general, a good thing to have more diversity in the system, right? But I'm certainly not saying that there should be absolutely no collective sort of discussions about what children need, what schools should be providing, right? And I'm not sort of advocating that we just have complete hands off of any kind of, public authority over what children can, the kind of education that children can receive. But I think there's a worry that, I think we've gone too far in the other direction, is what I would say. I think there's a tendency to go too far in the direction of, we know what's best and we know what model of education will work for everybody. And I just think we need to be a bit more open to the fact that children learn in all sorts of different environments and in all sorts of different ways. And Now, education is not just what happens in schools, and if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's probably taught us that, hopefully.
Am I live?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I come from a similar but different experience to the lady behind me. First of all, I went to a school which is called PNEU, the system which meant that you a private school, and it was designed so that you could pass the 11 plus. After I think about a year and a half, I was off-rolled and went off to the local primary school, state, which was again a mixed bag. Some of us survived, most of us didn't. Out of my class of 38, I think it was, we had, I think, 3 people who actually got to grammar school, and then one of them, who went to the secondary modern, managed to find all his brains in his right foot, and he scored 3 goals for England in the World Cup. So what? He was a good buy. Then I went on to a boarding school, which in the 1950s, I was mixed up with a school where I had about 30% were from the Near East, Middle East, students who were basically trying to learn English. Then we had a lot of students who were there because their parents were migrating all over the world in that they were from military backgrounds, which opened up your mind in different ways. It also was a lot more free in that you were sometimes given responsibility for doing something. I luckily was given at a very young age part responsibility for calling the model shed, where we made model engine, aeroplanes and sailing boats and all sorts, in which I was able to build a hovercraft in the days when that was a brand new idea. We had the scope to be able to try things. Then I went, became an apprentice, which was outside the normal school. Now, most of what we seem to have been talking about this evening has been the school system as in primary, secondary, and to a certain extent, I suppose, pre-university almost. Whereas with teaching I've done, I started teaching when I was, the last year of my apprenticeship in a factory. And then you find that it wasn't an aim, it was just to teach them how to work in a factory environment. And we had students in that group, so 15 at a time, some of whom were beginning to be potential labourers, and others who were pre-university, and occasionally a postgraduate would come along. So, complete and utter mix. I found that in teaching later, if you could get the student to want to come to your class, you could get far better results in that they would understand what was going on. This applies to some students who were learning disabled later on, and also when we had other things, we used to ask the students, how could you improve the course? And they would say, make suggestions, and some of them were quite radical, and I tried them out, but discussed it with the head of department first, and we found that my dropout rate was about 2 or 3%. The business studies would lose a third of their students in the first term of a 2-year course. So somewhere in between the anarchist being, was Mr. Southfield anarchist? I'm not sure. Students, or there was one system we had where the people who failed to get to any work or anything into further education, and they were offered a room, a computer, a lecturer, and no syllabus. They had to ask what it was they wanted, and they didn't know how to ask. They didn't know what the questions were. Now, I would suggest to anybody who's going into education now, it's on a logarithmic scale. What took hundreds of years to change to about the 1950s was then condensed quite a lot because the schools started coming in with curriculums. Now it is so constrained, I understand that if you have to talk about sex education, you have to work to the script. My chance on that one was in Birmingham. I had a group of bricklayers. I said, okay, what do you want for the last lecture? And they said, we want to talk about sex. All they wanted to know about was contraception. Now these were 18-year-olds, and they didn't know anything about it. Luckily I had. And so, if you're looking to see what the future's like, don't bother. Only try and remember that within 6 months, a year, things will be turned upside down. I did learning and machine learning before computers were invented, and it was useless.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for also referring to the whole area of adult education, which I didn't really talk about, but I think this is, what you've described is actually what's gone on in the field of adult education, which has all become much narrower and constrained by these kind of directives and funding, has had a lot to do with that. So thank you.
I think we had, if
Yeah,
that's okay, we've got a question here, and then, I've got you over there.
Just really quickly, and I'm not really sure how to phrase it, so hopefully you might understand what I'm trying to come from, but do you think that education could be used or will have the potential to help young people recover from the impacts of neoliberalism and individualism, that's the political ideology that has been dominant in this country for such a long time?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I think, I'm a bit wary of sort of using terms. I think neoliberalism for a lot of people in social sciences has become just like an insult that's flung at anything that they don't like. So I think you have to be very precise about what you actually mean by neoliberalism and how it's affected, specific aspects of our lives. It's quite a big general term. I think that schools and other both formal and informal educational spaces can be places where you can challenge dominant ways of thinking about the economy, about how we relate to each other, the relationship between the individual and the state. Yes, I think that can happen, but I think it doesn't happen just at a kind of cognitive level. That's why I think these experiments are so important. So, I think what alternative schools are doing is actually embodying different values. They're actually living in a different way. They're enacting different forms of social relations. So it's not enough to have children in school learning about, what democracy is and critical thinking and problems with the market and, why the neoliberal system is increasing inequalities. I mean, sure, we should do that. That's great. But that's not how you're going to challenge the sort of dominance of particular ways of being, because it's much deeper than that. So I think that's why we need these spaces where people can really interact with each other in different ways. And I think schools can be those kind of spaces, but that means having a lot more freedom to work in ways that don't meet the sort of requirements of the national curriculum and the standardised testing. So it would require much bigger changes for that to happen. But I think it can also happen in sort of small ways in which people resist ways of operating, in institutions. I mean, I do this the whole time in my own institution, right? Maybe if this is being recorded, I shouldn't. I think all of us who are in institutions which we think are partly dominated by logic that don't really make sense and that are serving external ends that we don't agree with, can find small ways to resist that. Not hugely optimistic at a political level, but yes, I think it's possible, is a short answer.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, just to start off, very much enjoyed the talk, so thank you very much for that. I very strongly agree with the idea that an abstract concept like education cannot have an aim. But I want to talk more generally about politicians in the conventional sense of politicians and their need to use education in its statism form and use schools to promote themselves or their party or to maintain their status. And because they use education in that form, there's an increasing element in education, particularly prevalent in the last 20, 30 years, where there is a need to measure education. And so by measuring it with various outcomes of all sorts of assessment, we've kind of moved further away from education and curiosity and more into an assessment-driven form of education within the societal statism sector. And I wonder what you thought about that, given that education as an abstract concept cannot have aims and that we're trying to measure it. Thank you.
Well, yeah, so the way you phrase that, I mean, to me, I agree, but I think that to understand why that's happening and why it's difficult to challenge that, I think you have to ask much bigger political questions, right? So I think the reason that there's an obvious, temptation for politicians to do that and it serves an obvious political purpose is because we live in a system in which the kind of educational qualifications that you end up with have a really strong causal relationship to the kind of socioeconomic position you can occupy, right? But that's a political question. That's because of the way we've constructed our economy, our political institutions, right? We live in a world in which that correlation is just part of the way systems work, right? So given that, it then becomes necessary to measure things, right? Because that's become the way we think about how you slot people in to a particular position within a socioeconomic hierarchy. So what we need to do is challenge the hierarchy, right? Challenge the kind of political systems which make it seem completely normal that someone working as a carer earns, barely a minimum, barely a living wage, whereas someone moving around imaginary pots of money in a building in the city earns 5,000 times that amount. That's what needs to change, right? And at the risk of sounding completely utopian, I mean, I think the measuring and the standards can't be addressed without addressing that bigger system within which it becomes necessary to position people differently in the system. But having said that, I think there are still educational spaces where you can experience learning that isn't just done for the sake of an external measurement, right? I think there are all sorts of spaces where that goes on, and sometimes in schools, but sometimes outside of schools, right? I mean, I like to think that some of us in universities are actually engaged in a genuine project of inquiry and learning. Sometimes it gets kind of squashed because of all the sort of external compliance that exists around grades and assessment. But again, I think it's about kind of finding those spaces where you can enact different forms of being in learning. But remembering also that there's a bigger political reason behind this, and that's what ultimately you have to criticise. So I haven't really answered the question. Sorry. I mean, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with your point about politicians.
Microphone on its way. Yeah.
Hello? Oh, okay. Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was really interesting. My question is, taking the anarchist squint, I think I agree, allows us to view education in a much more broad way and think about what we mean when we talk about education. And something you said that I also agree with is the idea that if we have aims of education, and we're trying to evaluate how we're educating in relation to aims, that we're going to narrow down the scope of what we count as education. So my question to you is, if we're trying to evaluate education or an educator without aim, how do we do that? And is the idea of evaluation or improvement of education even compatible with a non-statist view of the project?
Well, it depends who's doing the evaluating, right? I mean, I think if individual parents and communities felt more of a sense of involvement in schools as public spaces, then that process of what you refer to as evaluation, that would be part of the process of being in a community and working those things out together. I think the problem with the dominance of the state schooling system is that it leaves all those questions sort of outside the school gate. So if you look at controversies in recent years, so recently there was this big controversy in Birmingham, for example, between the community of parents who objected to the way in which sex and relationships education was being taught in school. Now that gets positioned as, you know, the education experts and the state and the representatives of, you know, the liberal democratic state on the one hand, and these sort of problem parents on the other who are outside, right, who are not. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't real conflicts and real tensions there. There are. There's a real clash of values. But if the school were a genuinely public place, those tensions would be inside the school. They would be part of that community's attempt to agree on what kind of space they want their children to be in and to learn in and to feel comfortable in. Instead of which it all becomes kind of, you know, either delegitimized or just an external political battle that's supposed to be kept away from the actual business of education. I don't think it's separate from the business of education. I think those questions are precisely what schools should be thinking about. And I think if you look at what happens in schools that have more autonomy and where there is more kind of experimentation, people are constantly thinking, yeah, what do you really want to teach here? What do you want to learn? Why are we learning this rather than that? Right? Why is that child not interested in this particular thing? What authority should I have as a teacher? Those are constant, ongoing questions. They haven't all been resolved. And I think what the state schooling system tends to do is to assume that they've been resolved sort of elsewhere, and that now we just need teachers to be trained and get on with the job, and children to turn up at school and do the exams. And I feel like that's just leaving out all the really interesting educational and moral and political questions that should be at the heart of how we introduce children into society, make them part of the social world. So it might be a slightly evasive answer, but it's the way that we think about the questions, I think, that needs to shift.
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I've been a teacher for nearly 30 years now, and it's lovely to talk about autonomy and experimenting. It gets you very excited, and we're told constantly that we should be research practitioners, and that sometimes at the end of the school day, you know, we and my colleagues pick up a book about education, and you just feel pretty exhausted, really. But fundamentally, we're still there. But one thing has really struck me. I'm not sure if I'm asking a question or saying something. One thing that just strikes me all the time, that I think that concerns me about education is just the potluck nature of it. Not just about your postcode, or even where your parents choose to send you, whether it be private or public, or you know, I've been to a Montessori school that I thought was appalling, but because of the person that led it, it was the way that they interpreted that philosophy, and I've been to two different Steiner schools, and they couldn't have been more different. And it constantly strikes me just how even one school, if you're lucky, you'll get this teacher. If you're unlucky, you'll get that teacher, and they can have a huge effect. And often we hear all the time, oh, I was just, you know, famous celebrities saying, I just happened to, you know, at the end of the day, the art teacher said to me, you've got something, and wow, the luck, the nature of luck is just is too large in education, And so therefore, linking back to what you said before, I love that idea that schools become more public and therefore, you know, they could be more democratic spaces. So you've got access to more people because, especially in primary schools where I work, you know, it's just, you're with the same adult day in, day out for 9 months. That's too long. It's too dangerous. And you might be lucky, you might not. But the effect, the profound effect that one adult can have on you is really frightening. Or conversely. And I know you were talking about theories and that the idea of public spaces and this gathering up and the lady at the back, you were talking a lot about dialogue. And perhaps it's just about creating a bit more dialogue and bringing people together, bringing people into schools or bringing children. I suppose I am thinking about children because that's who I work with, taking children into public spaces where they have a broader education, just more people. Just more people. It doesn't matter what their philosophy, their educational philosophies are, but they have more access to more ideas. They don't have that at the moment. It's just such a matter of luck who you have and whether they've got the energy to do anything other than what the government's telling them to do. And gosh, that's tough, isn't it? So that's a really exciting idea. I love that. I'm going to take that away with me from this talk, this idea of more people into schools, children getting out and meeting more adults with a variety of ideas and this gathering together. I think it's a lovely notion. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. I mean, I think in a way, precisely because of what you said, and it's so true that so much of it is luck and completely contingent, haphazard aspects of, you know, which cohort you're in even, right, which day of the week you start school, all sorts of crazy, but I think precisely because of that, in a way what I'm asking for us academics is something fairly modest, right? It's just to sort of get away from this hubris of saying, you know, children will learn this and the aims of education should be this and all children, because we know that at the end of the day that's not actually what's going to determine how children come out of schools. All we can really do is try and make schools the kind of places that it's good for children to be in. And that's, I think, is a much more modest and doable kind of thing than getting a clear agreement on the aims of education and how they can be realised through a national curriculum. But the other thing that I feel I should say, because I'm slightly worried that it hasn't come across in my talk, is that I think a lot of very ordinary state schools are doing fantastic things. And a lot of what I'm trying to describe is actually what's already going on in schools, in very ordinary schools. But my point is that we sometimes don't see it because we're too busy focusing on the kind of big thing of, you know, are the children attaining the national standards? Are they getting the curriculum? I mean, I'm a governor at a local infant school, and so much of what goes on there is just fantastic because it's doing that very simple job of introducing children into the world, of bringing these children into this space and saying, this is our world, this is what it's like to be a person in this shared, pluralistic, complicated world, and here's how you manage all these different aspects of, you know, getting along in the world, living with each other, you know, learning about the environment, yes, all those things. But that stuff is kind of what's invisible, because the bits of the school that they're constantly having to focus attention and resources on are, you know, how many children are attaining at the expected level at Key Stage 1, and, you know, how are they going to... And I think really all I'm saying is we need to just shift our attention back to the kinds of places that schools are, the kind of places they can be, the really important things that they do, which are about people coming together and learning how to live together. And there should be kind of more of that in our line of vision, as it were. That's perhaps all I'm saying when I think about it in the light of your question.
Yes, I'd just like to carry on the theme of this idea of the public, because when you were talking towards the end, I was thinking, wouldn't it be a good idea if all schools were known as public schools, and taking that term away from private schools like Eton and Harrow and so on, and calling them what they are, private schools, and the ordinary schools that we all know become public schools. But earlier on you were talking about community and the idea of education being more community-based. But I wonder if you think there's a difference between community on the one hand and a public space on the other. Because I'm a bit, there's part of me that's a little bit suspicious of communities. They can be a bit hidebound. Conflicts can be generated in communities that mean nothing. They're just about the personalities involved. There's a sense in which perhaps the school, the public school, needs to take people out of their community, or at least not out of it, but giving them a different perspective on their community, so that there's a difference then between community-based schools, which I'm a little bit wary of, and public schools, and I rather like that idea.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that is an important point. So on the public-private, I think it's just a peculiarity of the British system for historical reasons that we use the word public to describe what is, of course, a private school. You don't see that anywhere else. I mean, in the States, when people talk about public schools, they mean state-funded public schools. So I think it's just weird that we have that. And you're right, it would be good if we could move away from it, but it's one of those things, one of those great traditions of Britishness that was invented in Victorian England that we can't get away from. I think your point about community is important. Of course, yes, the worry about communities is that they can be exclusive. They exclude people. And they are, in fact, structured on the idea that certain people are not in the community, and we know how that functions to exclude and to reinforce power and privilege. So that might be one of the things that you would argue that the state should do as part of its oversight in providing public schools, would be to ensure that those public schools are as diverse and as integrated as possible. I mean, I think there's certainly an argument to that effect. And as you know, a lot of defenders of public, I mean really public, liberal state education have argued exactly that the role of the public school is precisely to offer a space where children encounter difference that they might not get if all their education and upbringing is within a kind of closed community. So I'm definitely sympathetic to that, but I still think that I still think that can be done in a way that doesn't dictate all the kinds of things that should go on in that public space. So we can try and make it more genuinely public. And yeah, I wouldn't want to say that we should allow any community to set up their own schools without any sort of oversight over who gets excluded and who gets privileged within those spaces. I think that's right. So there are considerations of equality that certainly are relevant here. Yeah. And like you, I'm a bit suspicious of the idea of community.
So it's me again. I do actually have a question this time, rather than just pure enthusiasm. So I think when you started giving this talk, there were 27 people in the audience, and now there are 17. And are you in the least concerned that this auditorium isn't packed? Because isn't education our future? And so that's one question. And I hope that you give this talk somewhere else and that the auditorium's packed, because I think it needs, this conversation needs to be huge. But also, how can, there's a really important element to educating, which is parents. And how can we encourage parents to be involved in education and educating their children? It isn't just, I think this is what you're saying, it isn't just taking place at school, it's taking place throughout life. But this appears to me to be quite a strong divide. The parents take the kids to school, they drop them off, they leave them there. And actually you can go home, you can learn to cook with mum, you can learn to make the beds, you can learn to grow veg, you can learn to read, you can, there's so many, you can broaden your vocabulary and discussion at the dinner table. There's so many different ways in which parents can be involved. And how do you see a dialogue bridging to parents? So first of all, are you concerned about the numbers, and how are you going to dialogue with parents?
So we're back to the numbers.
Yeah, I'm not concerned about the numbers at all, for various reasons. One of them has to do with the fact that I think many of us are only just emerging from 2 years in which we got used to having everything online, and I'm quite flattered that so many people came out in person to sit here on a sort of Tuesday evening. Yeah, it would be nice if more people are having, but I think these conversations are taking place. I'm not the only one talking about these ideas. I think these conversations are happening. I'm happy to have, anybody come and have a conversation with me. I don't need a packed auditorium. But I think it probably does have something to do with the point at time which we're at the moment. Or maybe it's just not a very interesting topic, or, I don't take it personally. Yes.
I'm not asking about whether you take it personally, I'm asking about societal concern that there are more people here, that there are more people.
Right, but I don't think that means that people are not interested in these questions. I think there's a lot going on in various forums, not just in academia, in informal conversation. I think we need to pay attention to those conversations and see them as part of a process of working out what we want for children, what kind of educational values are. I think parents have those conversations the whole time. Those conversations are happening at the school gates, they're happening on social media, they're happening in lots of spaces. I think the worry perhaps that I have is that too many of those conversations get channeled into a kind of very narrow set of concerns about, what school can I get my child in? What GCSEs are they going to do? That's, because as an earlier commentator, that's the kind of system we live in. So it's hard for parents to actually find a space in which they can ask those bigger questions. But I think parents, certainly during the school closures, during COVID, when so many parents were suddenly faced not just with the challenge of teaching their children at home, but also faced with confronting what it is that schools do, right? Because I think a lot of parents just assume that, you send your child to school, hopefully, you don't have much contact with the school because they only contact you if there's a problem. You assume that most of the business of school is, teaching children the curriculum, and they learn how to read and write and a bit of other stuff if they're lucky. And you don't pay that much attention to all the other stuff that schools are doing. And I think one of the things that the pandemic and the school closures drew attention to is the other function that schools perform, this kind of socializing public function, that what children get from just being in a different space with other children, with other adults. And I think we should be having more conversations about that and how we can make sure that those spaces are there for children who need them, that they're properly resourced, that they're available, that they're, plural, to go back to Jeff's point. Instead of which, the conversation seems to have been completely diverted into a concern with, how are all these children who missed out on the curriculum going to catch up? And that, I think, is a real missed opportunity. Right? So I think there is a kind of opportunity to think more radically about what schools need, what kind of places they can be, what kind of resources are needed to ensure that they really give children what they need. And instead of which, I think, we're just moving once again into this kind of very narrow way of thinking about education in schools. On parents, I do think that parents are educating their children the whole time. Right? They're teaching them things. Children learn things the whole time, even when they're not in school. So I'd be very wary of a kind of idea of parenting that sees it as a particular set of skills that have to be learned and passed on, or that sees it as something completely separate from the main business of education. And I think if parents are more involved in schools, then that's certainly one way that can change. A.S. Neal, of course, famously thought parents were part of the problem, right? The reason he wanted Summerhill to be a boarding school was to get children away from their parents.
I totally disagree.
Yeah, well, but yeah. I mean, but we certainly know that a lot of parents, and so we saw this during the pandemic as well, that for a lot of children, being at home was not a healthy or safe place to be, right? And being in a school away from the home, sadly, is actually a lot better for children. So I think, we do need to be aware of not having too idealistic a view of the home on the one hand or the school on the other. That neither of those spaces are unproblematic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for questions, comment, discussion. It's been very engaging. We have recorded this session, as I said at the start of the session, and that will widen the audience. So if I may try to reassure you, we have a much bigger audience than the audience we have in the room, and this is one of the things we've learned of the past couple of years in particular is that we've been able to widen the audience, and even though today we haven't been able to interact with our virtual audience, but the debate is going to be available, including all the questions and comments raised. So I think that's good news somehow. And as you said, we are still in a process of, for many colleagues and students and people, learning to go out, learning to stay in the university, and this late is something that we've completely forgotten, and over the past 2 years we've had no opportunities of doing it. So people have to learn to do certain things, and I'm glad that so many of us, not just tonight, but over the length of that series so far, and we still have one session to go next week, and I'm glad to see that we've been able to maintain that audience on site, but also the number of visits to our website and the recordings that are available there. So thank you, thanks everyone for joining tonight, and again a big thank you to Judith for her brilliant contribution tonight. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you for your attention.